right. So thanks again, Donna. As you know, it feels a little odd to call you that, but I'm going to go with it. And let's start off then with where are you currently employed and what is your main role there?
Ah, okay. Well, I am Professor Emeritus from Gallaudet University, and that means that I actually retired from the university. And so my obligation to the university now, it doesn't exist. The benefits to me is being able to stay associated with the university and to make use of their databases, electronic resources, libraries, and so forth. And so I left Gallaudet about 7 years ago after more than 30 years of teaching there because I felt like I had contributed a great deal to this community. It's the deaf community. That's who the university serves, and that I had prepared PhDs in deaf education who could come in and take over the teaching role, and I felt could do a better job because they had that lived experience of being deaf. And as my students would remind me, you're not deaf yet, Dr. Mertens. We're all temporarily able-bodied.
Yes.
But I'd also had a lot of requests to do consulting. And I found that trying to have the full-time job teaching and doing consulting work was becoming a lot for me to do. So those two things really led me to say, all right, I'm going to leave the university, but I'm not going to stop working. And so I work now as a consultant. I do it as an independent. So I don't have a business. I respond to requests, and um, I decided as long as the requests keep coming, then I will keep working. As long as they're for things that people say, we have this issue around human rights, we have this issue around marginalized populations, and we think that what you have to say might be something that's useful to us. And so that's how I ended up down in Trinidad twice now. Because of invitations. And so I do respond to those, and I have, I say I don't want to work too much because I'm 72 years old, but I am consulting probably with about 12 organizations right now that range from the United Nations and their International Fund for Agricultural Development to a private corporation here in Washington, D.C. that's seeking to obtain funding for projects that include issues around diversity. And they needed to have their evaluation plans reflect that. And so they asked me to come and work with them. And so I work with professional associations, foundations, universities, government organizations, and it's just dependent on who contacts me and says, we'd like you to do this. And then the other thing that I do is write. I write obsessively, some might say. Um, I finished the revisions for the 6th edition of my research and evaluation book in education and psychology, and then completed the writing of a new book called Mixed Methods Research that just came out this year. And I am immersed in the 3rd edition revisions for the program evaluation book. So I do a lot of writing, a lot of speaking, and that's what keeps me busy and keeps me willing to get up and keep going.
Oh, well, that is so inspirational and so remarkable at 72, and you make it sound, well, not you make it sound, you clearly enjoy it. You clearly enjoy contributing in this way, and that really is inspirational for me. Tell us a little bit about your journey to being in this position that you are in. So, what are some of the other roles you might have had over the years? I know you had the 30 years at Gallaudet, but what other sorts of roles have you served in your journey to become the researcher that you are today?
Well, I mean, I could start with my family's move from the state of Washington in the Northwest United States to the state of Kentucky, which is in the Southeast. And that was transformative for me. I was only entering seventh grade, and it was in the early 1960s. And in Washington State, I had never seen a person of color. Everyone looked like me. I moved to Kentucky and I immediately saw there was a large presence of Black people. Uh, at that tender age, probably at 10, 11 years old, I said, how come the Black people aren't in my school? And the teacher said, oh, Donna, they just prefer to be with their own kind. And I knew because I'd been downtown that the Black people were living in what were really considered to be the slums, in poor housing. They weren't living out in the nice suburbs. They weren't allowed to go to the swimming pools. And this was early 60s. So it was the beginning of the civil rights movement. And I mean, I just looked at that teacher and I thought, no, there's something wrong with that picture because no one by choice would say, oh, yeah, I want to stay living in this poor housing condition and not go to this nice school in the suburbs and live out there where there's swimming pools and so forth. And so I was like, well, okay, what's going on? And so I started to investigate with the eyes of a child, really, what was happening with the civil rights movement. And it just struck me that there are all these people of color in the streets protesting, and I want to know if it's making a difference. And I wasn't an evaluator or researcher at that time, but I was starting to think like one. What difference does it make if we have these social movements, if we bring up and bring to visibility the discrimination that's going on? And that really led me in my work whenever I was had a professional position to ask those kinds of difficult questions. So one of the first jobs that I had after I finished my bachelor's degree in psychology was as the coordinator of research and evaluation for the College of Medicine at the University of Kentucky, where I was working on my PhD. So, trying to balance everything. And they asked me to look at their admission requirements and whether that was leading to successful candidates in their school of medicine. And so I did, and I did fancy statistical calculations, which is why they hired me. And I said, there is a positive correlation. If you look at someone's undergraduate science grade, you look at their MCAT, the entry test for medical school and science, there's a high correlation to success in medical school. But I didn't stop with just that conclusion, which I think they would have said, well, okay, thank you. I said, but maybe there are other characteristics of physicians that would be important to consider, maybe like race, because we live in a state where there are a lot of Black people, and there's almost no Black people in medical school at that time. Maybe gender. Maybe a woman would feel more comfortable having a medical discussion with a woman doctor. And and so I had to raise those issues because in me I knew that that was the right thing to do. And so I was always searching for how do I bring that part of the discussion in, even when it's not asked for. And so from that, when I left the College of Medicine, I went to work for the Appalachian Regional Commission, which is it's a federally funded agency that works with people who live in high poverty areas along the Appalachian Mountain chain. So it goes from New York down to Alabama, all the states in between. And we were tasked with the provision of continuing education for people who lived in those areas, and we were doing it virtually. Now realize this is now the early 1970s, so we were doing virtual education way before it became a word. And I was the person who kept saying, we sitting here should not be the ones who make the decision about what the people need. We should be doing needs assessments. We should be going out and talking to the people and finding out what's important to them. How can we be of most help to them? And then assessing whether or not we're actually meeting those needs. And so I would raise issues and I would say, well, there's quite a presence of people who are saying that gender issues need to be addressed. And so I still remember people at the table saying, oh, that's Donna's issue. And I would be like, no, it's over half the population of the world. And so I worked there for quite some time. I finished my PhD working there and then went on to Ohio State University, where I worked at the National Center for Research in Vocational Education. And there I was able to select projects related to vocational education. And I was always doing research and evaluation. I was never the person implementing the programs. And so I would select things like people who lived in the inner city, people who dropped out of high school, people who lived in isolated rural areas, women in the workforce, people with disabilities. And so I was able to bring data to policymakers to say, what's going on here? We're preparing girls, women for occupations that have no advancement potential and that are paid significantly less than men. So I was able to bring those kind of issues to visibility to the United States Congress, because that's who I worked for. And then we had a president, Ronald Reagan, who was very conservative, and he said, I don't want any more studies like that. And so I said, well, I don't want to work here anymore. So I looked around and I found an advertisement to teach research and evaluation at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. And I didn't know anything about it. I had never met a deaf person before, but that reinforced for me that this was a marginalized population and that was what was missing from my ability to really be persuasive and useful in serving that population, that I needed to put myself in a context where I could be close to that community. Okay, like I said, I'm not deaf yet, so I'm not a member of the deaf community. They did accept me as a member later, as a member of the American Sign Language community, because that's the language we taught in. We used American Sign Language. And I didn't know the language when I got there. I knew very little about deafness, but I knew that I needed to learn. I knew that I needed to enter with an attitude of humility. And so I started out teaching, and my students, well, they deaf people have to look at you to know what you're saying, and I could see they were, not engaging. And so I said, well, let me have a conversation instead of just trying to teach people who are saying, giving me the 100% message. There's something wrong with this picture. So I said, let's just have a conversation. And they said, well, what you have to realize, Dr. Mertens, is that research has been used to negatively characterize us, to depict us as people who were emotionally unstable, unable to learn, or they just ignored us and we weren't included in the research. And so I said, well, what has to change? Let's keep this conversation going. And that honestly is where the transformative approach to research started, because it'd been in my heart, it'd been in my values, it'd been in my practice, but I had not articulated it as a framework for saying this is how to think about the conduct of research when your goal is to address issues of discrimination and oppression and human rights with members of marginalized communities. And so I started to develop that. I brought in work from feminists because they were the only methodologists talking about these issues. And I thought, well, it's not 100% applicable, but let me just test it out. And the students were like, yeah, those are the right issues. So they really encouraged me to keep pursuing it. And as I worked through, then I could see the commonalities when you're trying to deal with that kind of population across the different dimensions of diversity that are used for discrimination. So it can be gender, it can be sexual orientation, it can be race, ethnicity, language, religion, age. I mean, it's very contextually dependent. But there's also the intersectionality of those characteristics. So it's not one thing that we need to look at. And so that's why I developed this idea of transformative approach, because I wanted some kind of umbrella that would say, let's bring those voices together and see what we learn. Well, people found out about it because I write a lot, because I talk a lot. And so that's when the invitations started to come to say, well, we're not working with the deaf population, but we're working with women who experience violence in Kazakhstan, for example. Can you come and work with us? We're working with refugees who are coming over from Africa into Italy. Can you come and work with us? And so it really just evolved from people saying on their own, what you have to say has some relevance for us, and we think it might be useful. And so that has been the progression of 50 years of work.
I mean, it really is fascinating for me. And to think of the 11-year-old Donna in Kentucky already feeling that sense of, you had an innate sense of justice. It really did not feel right. The explanation didn't sound valid. And so you just kept pushing to get to a better explanation. And then, all the way then to Ohio and then to Gallaudet. And I'm hearing from you your focus on areas such as diversity and investigating and supporting marginalized populations. What would you say then are the main areas or fields of research that you have published work in?
Mhm. Well, honestly, I am a methodologist. And so, people say, well, what's your discipline? I'm very interdisciplinary, and I don't claim to have expertise in all the fields in which people invite me to work.
Right.
I am not a specialist in violence prevention, and yet people ask me to come and work with them. And so what I have to say is that's your area of expertise. I can bring a methodological framework, but it's going to require us to bring those together with you making your contribution from your understanding of that specific area. And so that is really why I have worked across sexual abuse in residential schools for deaf people, access to court systems for people who are deaf. As I mentioned, the prevention of violence for women in Kazakhstan and many other countries as well. The issues around LGBT in India, where at the time I was working with them, it was in their constitution that that was illegal. And since that time, they have changed that. Now, I'm not saying it was all me, but I was able to be a part of that process to work with someone who knew that community, lived in that community, and we together created this transformative approach that could gather people's voices and present it to policymakers. And that's really what I write about is methodology. How do we bring that framework to issues that are really problems that are very entrenched and require systemic change?
Then change and transformation is really at the heart of your methodological input into all these various projects. Um, in your 50 years, as you've described it, what would you say have been some of the facilitating or hindering influences for you as a methodologist or in any other fields that you've worked in? What has helped and what has hindered you along the way?
Okay, well, I think, to start with the positive, I think knowing your values and living your values. I've had people say things like, well, how can you bring your own values in when you're asked to work on the design of a project? And I'm like, how can you leave your values outside the door? It should be a part of the conversation. And it's not that I say it's my values the way I understand them, my cultural understandings that drive everything, because I also need to be critical of myself. So I think that first ability to know what your values are and how they would influence what you're going to do. Secondly, recognizing that you bring your own cultural blinders in and you need someone from that community, from that experience to say, no, you don't have it right this time. You need to rethink that. And I mean, just as one example, because we used American Sign Language at Gallaudet, and it was a very what they called culturally deaf institution. And by that, they meant that that was given priority. People who used American Sign Language would be the ones whose voices needed to be heard first and taken as those with experience. Then I was asked to work on a project to improve the preparation of teachers using technology, but teachers for deaf students, and not only at Gallaudet, but across the whole United States and Canada. Now, not everybody uses American Sign Language. And so there were deaf communities that relied on lip reading on assistive listening devices that used other forms of sign language. And so I had to have members of an advisory group who represented those different voices say, Donna, you've been living in this little cocoon over here. You think you understand deafness, but you only got that part of it. Now let's expand how you understand that and what might be needed if you're working with people who are not in that cultural group. And so that for me was a real awakening that reinforced for me the importance of recognizing the heterogeneity within communities. Sometimes we say things like, well, the deaf people or the hard of hearing people or women or Black people. And it's simply not true that everybody in those groups is the same. And so I think one of the big challenges is recognizing the dimensions of diversity that are relevant within a context. And it is challenging because if you don't get it right, then your work is not going to be seen as valid by the members of that community. So I think there's a challenge for me personally coming in as a white woman from the United States with people going, well, what could you know about us? And so I think, my approach is always to say, here's the limit of my expertise, but I absolutely recognize the value of yours. And it's the only way we're going to be able to make progress. And so I think, understanding that we need to recognize there can be resistance. So not just resistance from the communities that have asked me to be there, but from the methodological community itself. People saying, well, it's all a good idea, but we can't do that because that's not what the funders are asking for. That's usually the first thing people say.
Yes.
And I always say, well, if funders are smart people and they are open to learning. And if you go to them and say, I know this is what the RFP or the TOR says, but let me just share some ideas with you that might lead to an increase in the potential for success. And those ideas are related to the use of a transformative approach, engagement with the community, maybe capacity building within the community to be a part of the methodological decisions. And all of that, there's good literature to show enhances the outcomes. And I mean, one of the reasons I keep publishing is so people can cite my work and go, according to Mertens, this is good practice. But it's not just me. I mean, there are lots of people and more people, thank goodness, who are writing from this perspective. And I just think as individuals, when we go in to negotiate to get funding, we can bring up these issues, we can cite the literature. As members of a professional organization, we can bring up these issues and ask our professional organization to take a stand and to speak to the funders as a professional group to this other organization to say, look, there's best practices things that we support as a profession. So I think at two levels, at the individual level and at the organizational level, we can respond to that. I mean, I still see things in books where they write about this approach and they'll say, it's all well and good, but it's doubtful anybody would want to put that much effort into doing it. I mean, that's the essence of what they're saying. And I'm like, well, I guess I just have to keep working and and get other people to say, look, we use that and it made a difference to us. So yeah, there's resistance at the community level, there's resistance at the professional level, but I mean, I'm just a firm believer that you have to stay the course, all the while learning and making adjustments and adaptations as you learn more.
Yeah, that's a great reminder, I think, to us all to stay grounded in your values and to use the established research and the network that you have around you to advocate for various causes, because that resistance is going to come, isn't it, no matter where you're operating. Thinking about some of those changes or the progress or the transformation you might have seen in various diversity settings, can you share with us one that stands out, a change or a transformation or a piece of progress you achieved with a team in a particular sector that really stands out for you across those 50 years?
Yeah, I mean, there's been occasions of elation and occasions of tears, and sometimes both in the same project. The one that comes to mind was one that was designed to address the issues of early intervention for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. And we had done a large national survey, and then we followed that up with individual interviews and with focus groups, because the large national survey indicated that there were certain subgroups who were much less satisfied with the services that they were getting. And interestingly, one of them was for parents whose children were hard of hearing. And so one of the things in the data collection that came to the surface was a parent who said that when she went into her doctor with her concerns about her child, because she said he's just stubborn, he won't do anything I say. And the doctor said, he's just a boy, and dismissed it. And then later, she found out that he was hard of hearing, very hard of hearing. And that when she would ask him to, turn off the television or brush his teeth, whatever, he didn't necessarily hear her. And so she would, like many of us would, I'm not casting aspersions or making admissions, but you raise your voice, and you might even get very angry. And she, in the interview, started crying and saying how she felt so bad, so guilty because of the way she treated her son, but she didn't know he couldn't hear. And so for me, I cried because you could just feel her pain. And so we took that research to different organizations where parents get together, parents whose children are deaf or parents whose children are hard of hearing. And just to follow that same example, we took that in to a session with parents whose children were hard of hearing, and many of them started to cry and talk about how that was their experience. And then they started exchanging emails with each other and saying, we need to form support. We need to support each other. And so they were then taking action to be able to support each other outside of our research. And so it's just things like that might seem small scale, but it is one of those things where you just feel that this is going to make a difference. And so just kind of continue that thread. That study was one of the first ones I did when I got to Gallaudet. So it's fairly old. With those researchers, we published a book. And about a year ago, I was down visiting friends in Alabama, and one of the women is an advocate in a school system. And she said that there was a student who had just started school, and she was convinced that this girl had a hearing loss. But the teachers were just saying, no, she's not smart enough. She doesn't pay attention, blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I wrote a book about that. And that is a common response, to dismiss it and blame the child or the parent. And I said, if you want, I can give you a copy of the book. And she goes, oh, yeah, sure. Okay. So I get home, mail it to her, and don't hear from her. So I get in touch with her later and I say, did you get the book? And she goes, did I get the book? I read it. I have notes all over it. I have sticky notes. I took it into the school. I read it to the principal. I read it to the teachers. The girl now has a hearing test scheduled. And then I followed up with her last week, and she said, yes, the girl is now in a school that provides support for children who have hearing difficulties and has hearing aids. So again, it's one child, but it's like made a big difference.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like a small thing to me at all, because in the story you shared about the mother making the discovery that her child was actually hard of hearing, as a mom, if you ever know that you've been unfair to your child, as you said, she came to tears, you could think about how that intervention would have helped to heal that relationship. And that's a lifetime. That's a lifetime
Mhm.
there of understanding each other better and being able to build that relationship. And then the network that was formed amongst all those children, well, young people, and that the ripples that that would have sent outwards, who knows where that impact ended, and it probably is continuing still. So, it's small things, and I feel like you that transformation um, would have led to a change that probably is still, rippling outward. So that's a fantastic story. Um, we want to start to come to a close now and actually ask you to share with our community of early career researchers any words of advice or wisdom for us, because as I shared earlier, we can sometimes be a little bit cowed and intimidated and worried about what we could possibly contribute. And you can almost stop before you've started, right? Which is a thing I think a lot of us early career researchers struggle with. And so any words of advice would be happily received.
Well, yes, of course. As a person of my age, I feel fine, sharing the wisdom that I have gleaned from many years of struggle. And I guess that's part of it, is that there will always be struggle, and that we have to embrace that struggle and say, look, if we're doing something that's so easy that we don't have to think twice about it, we are not really contributing in the best way that we possibly can, because there are problems out there that don't have solutions yet. And it's really up to us to be a part of the solution. One of my sons is learning disabled, and it's getting him through school was incredibly difficult. But he is now a civil engineer
Right, fantastic.
working in New York City. And I used to tell him, don't worry. That teacher doesn't know how to teach you, but we will figure it out. We will find a way for you to learn things. We will not give up. And what the world needs is someone who thinks differently, because we haven't figured out the solutions to the important problems yet. And you think differently, and that's going to be important. So for me, it really is saying, what's the purpose of my life? I mean, it's as fundamental as that. And if I have even a little tiny crack in the door that says you can make a contribution here, then I'm going to work towards that. So it's really believing in yourself that you have the ability. And if you are in a position where you have an education and you have sufficiently prepared yourself to begin to do research, you have the potential to be a part of the solution in a way that other people can't. And so don't waste that potential. Just keep doing it.
Oh, that's so encouraging. It really is encouraging. And I think it's wise words that, at least for me personally, resonate. Thinking about your purpose, not leaving your values at the door, walking with them, sharing them. And what came through for me in your earlier sharings was about that humility, to know your own limitations and to hear the voices of others, and ultimately to be part of the solution, which, I hope we can all contribute in some way meaningfully. So I want to say, Donna, thank you so much. This really has been a pleasure. And again, grateful that you would have shared this time with us. So thank you
Well,
again.
thank you for asking me. And I really am pleased that I've been able to share this with you. And I wish you all the best.
Yes, excellent.